So, welcome everyone to the Twitter space. We host it every Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern. Today, we are talking about, or I should say, the topic is should each user story provide user value? And the discussion is being led by Jon Fazzaro. John, did you want to take a minute, kind of just introduce yourself?
Yeah, I've been writing code for over 20 years, and some days I think I almost have the hang of it. And I'm a senior consultant at Industrial Logic. It's the best job ever, and I'm here to help people deliver better software sooner. And this discussion is a big part of that.
Nice. So let's, I guess, just jump right into it. How did this question in particular come up, I guess, as a topic of conversation? What made it front and center in your
Yeah, so
mind as far as the topic today?
this was
Sorry, go
actually
ahead.
a question that I had that was posed directly. I had started sort of injecting the topic of user stories or mentioned them to a group that I was teaching some other stuff to. Um, and one of the people, kind of privately asked me, "Hey, it sounded like you were saying, that this is a thing about user stories." And his direct question was, should every user story provide user value? Because that's not what it was in the environment that he was working in. That was not how they used that concept. And so I wrote him an answer, and then I said, you know what, that I think enough people are going to have this question that I should probably post this where a bunch of people can see it. It's a short blog post, and I thought we could begin the discussion with me just reading it aloud. It's a 1 minute read, so if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and do that.
Please do.
So, starting with the question, should each user story provide user value? Absolutely, 100% yes, every one of them. A user story is not a development task. It's not a screen, an API endpoint, or a database column. Those are technical horizontal slices of work. A user story is a fully functional vertical slice. Delivering it may involve working on one or more of those technical components. Tasks and user stories are both useful concepts, but conflating them causes harm to how we think about our work. And in software, how we think about our work is the ballgame. A user story is a tool for agility. The correctness of the software you make is unknowable until you deliver it to people who will use it. We have to be agile in our work to navigate this inherent unknowability. We can be agile by building the next slice based on what we learned from shipping the previous slice. To work this way, we're going to need to have one or more high fidelity conversations about each of those slices. And writing a user story is a way to start such a conversation. So that's it. That's my flag in the sand. What does that provoke in you guys? What's your reaction to that?
Yeah,
I feel,
thank you. Go ahead.
oh no, I was gonna say, I feel like you said a lot in a very short amount of time. And for me, I guess where it takes me immediately to is how you define a user story and identifying it as a full vertical slice versus just a horizontal piece.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So I think in this, the context for this is that this person had been working in an environment where user story was basically synonymous with a task that a developer does. So, for one example of this is that let's say they're building a feature. Let's say they're adding a button um, to the bottom of a page, and the button is like a call to action or something. But they're still working with how it should be presented to the user, and they're experimenting with that. So there's a feature flag around this to hide it. So they build it with a flag hiding it, and then they deploy that to production. And some of the users get the button in orange, and some of them get it in blue. And there's a little bit of experimentation going on there. But then there's also developer work to once they figure out how the button should look. Um, Somebody has to go in and remove the user flag or the feature flag rather. right? So there's another task that comes up along behind it, to sort of clean up, and that second thing that was deemed to be like that would be a second user story in this um, in this example. So like something that came along later, and they split it off because it would be something that was done later. Whereas if I was doing it, thinking about delivering user value, the whole thing is just one user story, and that last we have to remember to remove the flag. Um, that's a task underneath that user story because we haven't delivered user value until that's complete as well.
Thank you, John. Meanwhile, we are also joined by Timothy. Tim, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great that Tim's here because at the bottom of my um, ridiculously short blog post, for people who wanted a little more in-depth stuff on it, there's a link to a wonderful post that Tim did, that's much more thorough in exploring what makes user stories work for people and what doesn't. So I'm glad you're here, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. So I think if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that there's times when you create a user story and there's times when you create a task, or are you saying that tasks should not be created?
No, there's times for each of them, like the first one. Yeah, yeah. So tasks are. It's good to create tasks, and especially, for the kinds of things that maybe you thought it was going to be these three things, but no, it's the also these four things that we have to do, and we have to add a database column and do this thing too. That's where tasks really come in handy as far as keeping track of them. But that's all. That's kind of all under the umbrella of a user story.
Yeah, I think that sometimes the pain comes when people believe they can only write user stories
Yes.
and they can't write anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a big part of it. It's sort of, I think is that related in your head to like, we have to split the work up? We have to have small user stories and splitting them.
Well, I think that the problem then becomes you have huge stories that are like, oh, this story isn't still done because we have to do this and this and this and this and this for this to be a vertical
Yeah.
slice.
Yeah, and I think it's easy for especially us nerds to like we can really understand like the splitting things into smaller tasks. Like I've got to write the method in this service, and I've got to go add this row in the database. Those are obviously like discrete tasks, but as far as splitting things from a user's perspective, that's a lot more difficult for us. Mentally, the gymnastics are a little more tricky.
So I want to go in the past a little bit. I know, Tim, that in your blog you talk about what was there before user stories. So I was thinking we should, start from there and see where we have gotten so far. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. Basically, it was talking that before there was the user stories, there was just requirements documents that were massive documents that had all the details that they imagined would be needed. And the belief was they could capture everything they needed before they started work. And that was the problem with, one of the big things they discovered did not be true. And people who decided to take a more agile approach uh, started with the premise that that was not possible. And how do we make this work since that's not really possible? And so I think that one of the many things that we try to solve with user stories is the fact of having huge batches of work where all the pains that were involved with that, and to try to have user stories was a way of saying we're breaking this into smaller vertical slices and trying to think up, and this is where the skill really comes in. It can be a challenge. And recently, I'm working on a team with some people who are unfamiliar with this way of working, and they were struggling a little bit with the idea of splitting a vertical slice into something thin and quickly and easily deployable, as opposed to something that takes a long time and is very large. But that can often be a challenge. The to define the and it's a skill to be able to see things differently, to be able to slice something into a small enough slice that you have a user story that's um, a viable option for working in small slices, small batch sizes.
Right. Uh, Jay, can you just reset the room a little bit? I know there's new audience that has joined us, so I think this is a good moment for that.
Sure. Hey everyone, welcome to our Friday space. We host it every Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central. Today we are talking to Jon Fazzaro about a blog he wrote entitled "Should Each User Story Provide User Value?" And so that's what we've been talking about up until this point. Some really good points have been made. Really interesting that from my perspective anyway. If you would like to ask a question, add a comment, join the conversation, please hit the mic icon on the bottom left hand of your screen and request to be a speaker, and we'll pull you up. If you are joining from a desktop or a laptop computer and cannot use your microphone function, feel free to tweet us or reply to the tweet that we sent out for the room, and one of us will ask your question and so that the speakers can address it. So it sounds like, for at least from what I've been collecting, that when we talk about each user story providing user value, a core foundation of that is how you define user story. What I want to ask to complement that is, how do you define value when it comes to providing it for the user?
I think what I would say is, does the user, first of all, um, a user should notice a change in the experience of the software, whether that's a new feature, a new menu item, a new button, or um, a perceived improvement in something like the speed of a particular operation that they do. And that can be very small, or it can be, typically with a user story, you want to be as small as possible, as discrete from other improvements as possible.
Does it have to be a change?
Hmm.
Is the maintenance of a function enough to be considered valuable for the user?
Yeah, I don't know. And now that I said that, if you're referring to the performance improvement example that I gave, I'm second guessing that. That's definitely, I wouldn't represent that as a user story. That would be more like a closer to a defect fix. But definitely something, I think it is. It has to register some kind of change in the way the software works for the user. But if can you think of an example where it wouldn't be a change in the software? Because I can't.
I might actually take the stance that performance or something like compliance actually is user value, right? Like we comply with rules and regulations for the consumer or the user's benefit, and you can tell a story through that. It's not just a thing to do. It's the same with performance, right? If you have a let's say an HTTP API, right? Like, and you want your response times to be relatively quick. Well, the user cares about that. Slow response times are a bad experience, and so you can tell the story of a performance improvement from the user's perspective.
Yeah, it could be done. I suppose it's just I haven't seen it done that way. I don't think I would fight it. I don't think I would die on that hill if that showed up in the backlog.
So I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What do you think, or what criteria do you use to decide if something should be a task, or a certain scenario where you should be creating a task versus you should be creating a user story?
Well, the first criteria is, does the user experience a complete, like a change in the way an improvement, hopefully, but at the very least, a change in the way the software behaves or is used. And So that separates out like something like adding a database column, clearly a task because the user won't notice. So if the user, if does the user notice is like probably the number one question for, is it a user story or a task?
So say you have user stories and tasks. What is the value between identifying what you have?
Identifying, what do you mean by identifying what you have?
If you have a user story or a task?
Well, it's sort of because they're on different dimensions of, I guess we commonly refer to like vertical versus horizontal things. And the something being on the vertical dimension, as in the user notices a change, that means that it can be delivered as a whole thing, independently from other things that the user might notice. And what that gives you is all the articulation to be agile. So agility as I kind of alluded in the article, I said that we can't know the value of our work until it's in the hands of the users that are benefiting from it. So if that's the case, we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. We don't want to do a whole lot of work without first checking to see if, parts of it worked, so we can continue on based on those validated assumptions. And so the ability to be agile comes, in my opinion, but partly from the ability to slice small changes and deliver them to the user and get feedback on those things, as opposed to tasks, which if the user doesn't notice, you can't really get any feedback on a task. They're just sort of the component pieces of delivering a slice of functionality to the user.
So do you feel that both user stories and tasks should be deployed to production when they're completed?
With some other caveats in there, yeah. So you don't want to like deploy a partially done user story to where it's going to maybe break something else or be exposed to the user in a partially done way. So I'm thinking about feature flags in this case. So you could, if you had a flagging system that flagged the whole story off, you could be deploying after each task, but without necessarily releasing to the user. Is that what you were getting at?
I'm just trying to understand a little bit of the details of, so you're saying, if I understand correctly, it sounds like you're saying that a task is separate from a user story, but a user story is usually made up of tasks. Is that correct?
Yes. But what do you mean by separate in that sentence, the first one?
Well, if you have a task of removing the feature flag that's been turned on in production, you're not going to see anything. That's not necessarily a part of the story of delivering value, and it's not necessarily something that's giving any user value, but it helps give value to you or the other people who would have to manage those flags.
Yes, and it's also part of delivering the value to the user. So a task under a user story is something that you have to do in order to deliver that story. So taking the flag off at the end is something you're doing in support of releasing that to the user. And it also keeps the, and you mentioned it has value for the developers as well, because you're reducing the number of flags you have in process at any time. And then that reduces the complexity of the software or the complexity of the code. And by reducing the complexity of the code, you've sort of delivered quality value there by making it easier to change for the next slice.
Okay. So are you thinking that every task should be underneath the user story umbrella?
I am positive that there are cases where it shouldn't be. We shouldn't like have absolutes like you always have to do it this way. That's always a red flag for me. I said it's always a red flag for me. Get it? Anyway. So, Yeah, I think I'm sure there are cases where there's tasks to be done that aren't directly tied to something that the user's going to notice, but I think it could be, I think I could see it both ways. I think the gray areas there are up to your team, but if you think about something that you're doing to software to change it, like a task. I mean, if you ask the question why about that task, odds are you're going to get to a user story somewhere.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why would you do it?
So John, this is Perry. I like that thought quite a bit. And I think if you don't have that traceability, if you have things in your backlog, task in your backlog that you can't tie to a legitimate business need, then you really ought to question why you're doing it.
Yeah.
I had somebody share with me years ago an analogy. It's like, for those of you who have ever gone hunting, you can't just go on anybody's property and start, shooting things. You have to have permission, and you have to have a hunting license, that legitimizes your reason to be there and to go after whatever it is you're hunting. If you don't have a reason to modify code and you're just changing things because of your sense of aesthetics, it could be very dangerous. You could break things unnecessarily that could cost the company the company money. The hunting license, to me, is that metaphor applies to any kind of user story, like a new feature request or even a defect. It provides the pull, the reason to be in the code in the first place to make those changes. And I think kind of underlying this is the idea: who does the code belong to in the first place? It belongs to the company that's paying us to go make those changes. So it's an interesting thought. And if you have tasks that are just sitting out there, even if they're good ideas, you ought to try and find the connection back to the business value that it would deliver. And if you can't really find that, then you might want to question whether you should be doing it in the first place.
Yeah, I am not a hunter, but I think I have both experienced the hunter on my property, metaphorically, on a team, and also been the reckless hunter wandering onto somebody's property.
Right.
Yeah, but it brings up an interesting question, though, because I know, I'm thinking about, okay, well, what if we're cleaning code, and those things you said about you risk breaking something if you go in there and change it based on, say, aesthetics. But often the argument for cleaning code is that you're making it more stable in the face of the next change that's coming along. So how do you reconcile that? How do you balance that, Perry?
Well, that's a good point. If you're doing well, even that. I mean, I've yet to find a customer who's willing to pay a team simply to refactor their code,
Right.
or even to add more tests to their code. It's always there's a quality and improvement that is there, and you could argue and defend the merits of doing that, but it's almost never the case where they said, well, for the next 3 months we're just going to clean up the code. That's where the idea of the Boy Scout rule always comes into play, because the Boy Scout rule says that when we are in the code for a legitimate reason, like to add this new feature or fix this defect, that we will, like the Boy Scouts do when they set up a campsite, they will make the area around their campsite cleaner than it was when they found it. And that seems to be the strategy that I've always found most amenable to the client who is paying for all this. That if they're not getting observable value, it's like the performance improvement thing. Unless they're specifically complaining about performance, they may not notice or value effort spent on improving
Yep.
that.
Yep. Yeah, it might be a
but
thing that they
you know,
don't use that's slow.
exactly. So you know, it's you know, that applying the Boy Scout rule means that, you know, when I am in that area for a legitimate business read, like the reason to deliver a user story, then applying, you know, my skills as a as a good quality minded engineer to clean and refactor that code while I'm in there. That seems to be the best policy, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think that is the answer to the question, when do we clean the code? And that's, yeah, when you're in there working on the code, when you're changing that code, leave it better than you found it.
Right.
Other, you know, and
Yeah.
the other scenario where, you know, okay, let's take 6 months off of building new features to refactor or rewrite the system. Possibly the worst business decision in software that you could make.
Yeah. And I've yet to find a customer that's excited to hear that.
Yeah.
You will get no new value out of this, but the code will be a lot cleaner.
It'll be good for us.
Yeah.
This is Josh here. I got a quick
Hey, Josh.
example I could share. So on a system we worked on many years ago, it was all done. I don't want to get into too much of the technologies, but it was done with an older technology, which made it hard to white label the website. So white labeling, is we wanted other companies to put their logos and act as if it was their software. So, but the original software wasn't really designed for that. So there had to be a pretty big architectural change to the entire code base to make it more white labelable, if you will. And it went from being like static HTML to something else. Okay. Now, we didn't just stop everything and just say, great, we're doing this architectural change. We won't be doing any new work for the next several months. We didn't do it that way. What we did instead was we would choose an existing piece of functionality, which you could call as a user story, right? It's a user doing something to the system.
Mm-hmm.
And we would change that one area to use the new way. So we had the old way and the new way. I call this a partial, a gradual cutover in our refactoring album and e-learning. We were gradually cutting over from one old way to a new way, one little piece at a time. So one user story at a time. Anytime you touched a user story, you would also make that architectural change from the old way to the new way that was more white label friendly. But it was always, associated with an actual function in the software, something users do.
Mm-hmm.
And the details of that story. So you'd see on the whiteboard, it would say, user uploads XYZ or user performs this function, right? It's something that they were using the software to do. But the details of that story, that was the headline. The details of the story were, make the architectural change to the new technology. And if there wasn't anything else to do for that user story, right? So everything, even in an architectural change like that, was associated with user stories. Because it was, again, done in piecemeal and this gradual cutover, and it was done without stopping everything to just do architecture for a while.
Yeah, that's a great example, and I think that's kind of that's always the best way to make a large change to a used system is, sort of follow the user stories as they come in, because the user stories are I hopefully being guided by somebody who's paying attention to the user and is following what they need. So you're continuously delivering that value while also, you're able to sort of shift things piecemeal as you need to be. I think a lot of harm comes from seeing a software system as one big thing that's either got to be this or that, but more as a, like a river.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had a question for you, John.
Yeah.
You said earlier, you were mentioning about a defect. Do you
Yeah.
think of defects as user stories, or are they just tasks?
I think of defects actually as missed tasks on user stories that have already shipped. So sort of following the line of reasoning on, if you read up on like a zero defect policy that a team might adopt, rather than keeping a prioritized backlog of here's all the bugs we have to fix, they're very clear about what they define as a defect. And then for anything that they do define as a defect, that's the priority. We work on that until those are fixed, because they've already, like, their parts a defect in something that's out there that's been delivered as a user story that is broken, that is not working, means you aren't done with that user story. So it's already been prioritized over everything else that might be in your backlog. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for me, I guess I think of it as it's still a user story. I'd still put it on the board as a user story. It's just that the details of that user story are, oh, fix that defect.
Yeah, I definitely might write it in a different way, as far as the details go. But yeah, I think that they hold equal or greater, actually, greater priority value than any user stories that you have to do, but certainly equal.
Yep.
Josh, I think that's a great question. It reminds me of a company I worked in years ago where the customers noticed that the development team prioritized defects above everything else. And so we started getting defects that were basically a loose way of describing some missing functionality that they thought should be there, right? And just because they called it a defect, they were expecting to get a higher priority.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yeah. When you weaponize your process, something's probably wrong.
I noticed Tim posted a question about how narrowly do you define user? I'm interested, John, what you think about that.
That is a good question. I saw that. Well, yeah, let's talk about the different kinds of the different ways we could define user. So there's obviously like the human being poking at the user interface on the screen. What other ways? What other ways can you guys think of?
Hey, John.
Yeah.
This is Tim. I'm here.
Hey.
So typically you think of customer as the person who pays for the subscription or, however that is they pay. And you think of the user as the person who's poking at it.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, does that mean that you would never, ever create a feature to benefit ops who's trying to monitor the running system, and you would never do anything to benefit sales or marketing, and that you would never add anything, technical to a software system?
Yes. So
because they're not users.
Right. And that's exactly, I think that's the best way to look at this question. I think about not to name names, but everybody knows it. Facebook is holds a great example of this, because there's a lot of functionality in Facebook's software that is definitely not for providing users value. The users are arguably the product, and the value is, to advertisers or to Facebook as a business. So there's always value provided to the business from a software system. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. So there is a bit of a blind spot if you have this laser focus on the end user as the customer. So you're absolutely right. Value put into software systems often isn't about that person poking the screen.
So what about, there's no monitoring, there's no logging, but you need to get some information about performance and engagement, and your sales and your operations and your marketing people would like to see that, but that's a feature that isn't for the customer or the end user. Does that mean we shouldn't write that?
I think I want to extend the definition of user in this case to human being using software. So often I tell teams, like, if you get a task or somebody asks you to do something that involves a change to the software, that if it's not evident right away, ask why repeatedly until you get to a reason that's not about software. So with your case of we want to put in some logging so that, for example, marketing can analyze how users are using it and use that in their work. That's a user story. The marketer who is consuming that information is now the user of that story. It's a human being deriving value from the software in a specific case.
Oh, so it could be anyone in our product community. It doesn't have to be, it can be people inside our organization.
I would say so, yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I wanted to make sure, because I'm afraid that people would hear that as only external members of our product community, only the paying members can possibly have a feature, that we would never do anything for ourselves. And I want to make sure that everyone knows that's not what you meant.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. And I think there we maybe have a problem with vocabulary, the word user itself, which of course comes from the drug abuse community. So that's no fun.
Well,
Little
good. I'm
drug
glad we
abuse
got that
humor.
out there and shared that. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I recently worked with a client who one of the teams on at this company, the software they wrote was a very low level layer of software that the only thing that talked to it were other software systems, and so when it came time for them to describe the functionality they were going to add, there literally was no user touching anything. It was always another.
I see that Perry Reed's speaking, but I don't hear him.
I'm hearing him.
Yeah, we can hear him. Tim,
We
why
can
don't
hear
you
him.
rejoin the space?
Tim, you just need to turn off the Perry's talking filter. Oh. But anyway, that the idea that there's a there's a space where people who are building software, their software never actually interacts with human beings. So
That's really interesting. And what I think about when you describe that scenario is this is sort of a Conway's Law thing, isn't it? Because isn't that an artifact of how the teams are divided?
yeah,
I'm,
that's
yeah.
a good point. I mean, in that example, they're building something for somebody else who is in fact servicing a user. But the organization had kind of walled these groups off in a bit of silos, but that was their reality, and I was just curious if you run into that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is a huge problem when we go in, maybe to a company that has an arrangement like this, has teams divided by technical specialty rather than by business purpose, divided horizontally rather than vertically. And when you try to use a tool like user stories in an environment like that, in order to actually do it right, you'd have to have a user story that's striped across one or more, like two or more teams, because you need the API team to do this, you need the database team to do this, you need the Kafka team to do this, things like that, and then the UI team, of course. And then, so of course it falls apart in that kind of environment, because that's not it. Like many agile practices, it doesn't work, and in not working, it's showing you the problem.
That's a great point. In fact, I would say that if you find that, it's a symptom of a deeper problem, and it ties back to your vertical slicing suggestion.
Yeah. I think it's also probably the cause for the original question that prompted me to write this post was from a developer, I think, in an environment like that, where user story had become synonymous with task because they couldn't make it work without maybe an organizational change.
So I had another question.
Yeah.
I think in your article, I think it was there, or I jumped over to Tim Batty's article too, but in there was a mention that user stories are not requirements, and in a lot of agile teams I've worked in, that have used, whether it's an electronic representation of the story or even on a 3x5 card, the mentality has always been that when the story is implemented and everybody's agrees that the acceptance criteria for that story has been met, the card is literally torn up and thrown away, because the artifact itself, the user story, doesn't really need to exist anymore. It's in the software. We have other ways of sharing and telling the story about its existence elsewhere. But I've worked in several industries now that are heavily regulated. Both from the Food and Drug Administration or from financial regulations, and those entities often want to look at something. They want to be able to see, well, what was your requirement, and then show me how you have verified that that requirement has been met. So if I'm just curious, in that statement that user stories are not requirements, and I don't disagree with that. Do you have any thoughts about what to offer a company that is trying to meet and be able to answer well-intended questions from people that can literally shut your whole company down? What is the requirement behind this feature?
Well, I will yield to Tim Batty on this because I think that was a key part of his blog post. But before that, I think I will say that there's documentation is it's necessary for transparency in many cases, like the one you described, where we have to trace whether how this thing got into the software or whether the software does this or not. And the only correct documentation about a software system is its code, but that's not transparent because not everybody can read it, and even the professionally trained among us can't read a lot of code that's out there because it's terrible. So how do you get something that's 100% accurate in the way that code is, but transparent in the way that a human readable, a muggle readable document is?
So we had a comment from Christoph in the comment section, and he's asking if you rather speak of user story, a story being told by the user about a problem they face or a task they need to do, it may get clearer. Why would a user tell about an issue needing to be solved and not expect it to be solved?
I love the repositioning of user story. I mean, it's obviously in the name, but I think we've got a little vocabulary burn in over years of using user stories and maybe messing with the concept too much, like thinking of them as developer tasks. But the fact that drawing it back to, this is a story the user would tell about what they need, about a problem that they have that we can solve. I didn't quite catch the end of that though. Manu, can you repeat the last question in there?
Yeah, I think he added another comment just to clarify. So he's saying, is it worthwhile to address this from the other direction? When may a user story not provide value? What are some acceptable scenarios?
Well, there's always a chance that a user story won't provide value. And that's kind of in the beginning of the discussion, I was sort of parsing words about a user story is something that appears as a change to the user. So not necessarily, it's neutral, right? There's a change. It could be good, it could be bad. A user story, to borrow a term from, I think John Cutler coined this, but that every change you make, every user story in this case, is a bet. It's a bet, and it could go wrong. Like you could introduce a new button that does this thing, and the users hate it. They reject it. They don't use it, or they complain about it. Or they quit the app, or something like that. So that kind of embodies that whole thing I'm talking about with, we don't know how valuable this is going to be until it's done and in the hands of users. Every one of them is a bet. And so you want to keep your bets small, your user stories sliced thin, and aimed at the user. So I think it's worth discussing how something might not be valuable to a user, even if it's a change that theoretically was going to provide them value. That's an assumption that we have to validate by delivering.
Awesome. I see a lot of new speakers in the audience. So if you want to come up to the speaker panel and add some comments or ask a question, go ahead and ask for the mic and we'll surely bring you up. Or if you want to ask a question, you can also comment under the space, and that way we can bring in your questions or comments. So we are almost going towards the end of the space here. Would you like to, start with your closing remarks, and we can go around the speaker panel?
Yeah, you want me to make closing remarks?
Sure, go ahead.
Sure. Okay. Well, don't believe that your work has value before it's in the hands of somebody who's going to use it. And we need to be agile in order to navigate that minefield and deliver things that are valuable. And the way that we do that is by having user stories that are focused on actual changes that users experience and making them as small as you can, and not confusing them with things like, adding a column to a database.
Great. Tim, we have you back on the speaker panel. Would you like to go ahead with your closing remarks?
Sure. Recently, I heard something was said in a meeting by some executives where they basically made a comment that they couldn't believe that these users weren't wanting the things they should want. And I think that kind of spells out some of the trouble that happens in some of the in real scenarios where people don't understand what it means we're trying to accomplish when we say user story. We're trying to say is that we don't assume to know or presume to know what those users are actually going to want. And our goal is to try to, test and probe with small steps and say, well, we think they'll want this, and let's try this and see what and then we use the way that they respond to that to decide what we do next. And I think that's at the heart of the value of user stories is being able to say, we don't have the grand plan of the future and knowing exactly how everything's going to be used. And but we do want to think in terms of what is going to make the life best for the customer that we have. But yeah.
Thank you. Perry?
Yeah, just one last thought I had is if you don't maintain this idea that your backlog is full of things that are recognizably valuable to the customer, then it's really hard to prioritize them. If you're asking your customer to help you rank order the things that the team is going to work on, and they see things that they can't even explain, let alone attest to the value that would provide them, then I think you're starting off in the hole, so to speak. So being able to point to the value that an item is going to bring, brings a natural conversation about the cost of delivering that versus the expected value. And I like to comment earlier that everything's a bet, right? It might work out, it might not work out, but is the bet even worth taking the risk on? And you really have a hard time with that conversation if the item you're discussing isn't recognizable as value to the customer. I'm not sure what that
Okay. Okay, so before we go to Joshua, I think Christoph has joined us on the speaker panel. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I really like the notion that the user story is a bet and that we really don't know whether it will be valuable because this is absolutely up to the user. I can totally agree to that. However, this is not, as I understood, the original question, because when I take on a user story as a development team, I always would assume that what we deliver provides value to the user. And therefore, maybe I'm pretty radical in this view. I would say, yes, a user story should always provide value, at least in the original intent. But of course, after it's developed and users say, this is not really solving my issue, then yeah, we can say, okay, this user story did not provide any value. Okay, I can agree to that.
Yeah, I think you could broaden the definition of value to the people involved in the system, and say that if a user story was something that was not useful to the user or somehow made their experience less good, that you still gained value because you've ruled something out. Okay, not that. We know this now, right? It's
Yes.
validated.
It's a very good notion to take this. At least we learned something, and maybe it was not valuable to the user, but it was valuable to the development team because, yeah, learning.
Yep. And using that thing you learned when you pick the next user story you're going to do, taking that into account, not just steaming full speed ahead through a requirements document that happens to be diced up like user stories.
Yeah. I've nothing more to add.
All right. Thank you so much for joining. All right. So we'll move to Josh. Josh, you have any final words?
No, I think the concept of bets are great. If you go back to the Lean Startup book by Eric Ries, if you can quickly and cheaply either validate or invalidate an idea before investing a lot of time in it, all the better. There's all kinds of techniques for that. There's an entire book called Testing Business Ideas, David Bland and his co-author, Alex Suster, I can't pronounce his last name, but that whole science of just how do you do cheap, quick experiments to learn whether or not to build something is just an amazing way to save time and energy. So big believer in that.
Awesome. So I think we're gonna bring this space to an end. So Jay, why don't you close us?
Sure, thanks, Manif. First, I want to say thanks to Jon Fazzaro and everyone who joined this page to contribute to the conversation and tweeted in. Great conversation, as always. Again, we do this every Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central. If you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, feel free to tweet or DM any one of us. We'll get it added. Thank you again for a great conversation. Everyone stay safe and warm over the weekend, and we will see you here in the same space next week.
That soundboard is pretty great.